Hi, Molly. I'm really excited to talk to you today for a few minutes about our research, a break from both kind of a busy time of you finalising your dissertation and me kind of plodding on to the end of term. I just want you to start us off. Maybe you could introduce yourself and introduce the kind of the research and the project that you're going to talk about now.
So I'm Molly and I'm a final year history BA student and I'm currently writing my dissertation, which is entitled Voice, Body and Feeling, Plebeian Song and Gender Identity in 18th Century London. So my project is about how London experienced drastic changes to its urban landscape in addition to a lot of social change, meaning that it's an interesting time to assess plebeian culture and particularly domestic migration, encouraged more ballad singing, and there was also a ballad revival in the 18th century. So essentially I'm trying to look at how plebeian gender identity is constructed and expressed through vocal performances. So I'm looking at the musical, rhetorical, physical, spatial and emotional dimensions of performance, especially in group settings. So yeah, I guess Ben, if you want to also introduce yourself.
So my name is Ben Jackson. I'm a teaching fellow in early modern history. I did a PhD nearly 2 years ago now on masculine material culture in 18th century England that thought about not only what we can learn about masculinity and masculine identities through material culture, but specifically what were men's relationship and meanings that they attached to the objects that surrounded them in their everyday lives. And kind of born out of that research is a continued attention on masculinity and on men, but I'm looking at the clergyman in 18th century England, and my title of my kind of broader research project is The Clergyman in 18th Century England, the Professions and Social Identities 1660 to 1800. And you know, kind of similarly to you, I'm working on a kind of expanded idea of the 18th century. I'm kind of beginning from the kind of restoration after the instabilities of the Civil War. I'm kind of going to just the 19th century as a kind of point to stop, which is kind of the emergence of an evangelical, a re-emergence of an evangelical tradition. And really what my project is aiming to do is to think about how men, and specifically clergymen in this instance, as a kind of case study to think through this problem, understood the push and pulls on a kind of composite or pluralistic identity. Identities that were both masculine, very professional, social, and to try and think about the ways in which they understood and negotiated these kind of competing, often, I think, pulls and pushes on their behaviour, on their lives. And it aims to do that in kind of three distinct settings. So it's thinking about the household, moving then into the wider community, or really in this instance, the parish, and then moving finally into actually thinking about clergymen, travelling clergymen abroad. I'm thinking about both their work as missionaries, but also as tutors and diplomats, chaplains. And hopefully the project is thinking through these ideas to try and understand more complex, perhaps, identities experienced in 18th century England than kind of historians have hitherto wanted to discuss. So already we have a kind of really clear interest in identity, and I think that's the obvious kind of thing that binds our research in the 18th century together. But I'm interested always, especially when someone presents such a unique dissertation topic, why you first became interested in song and plebeian identity. Why the 18th century? Why have you wished to pursue this project?
So I mean, my original thinking was I love music and I've always enjoyed analysing music, but most historiography on music in the 18th century has focused on elite music, and Handel, for example. And whilst that I do find that interesting, I remember reading an article, Rosalind Carr's A Polite and Enlightened London, which said how there's very little in general on plebeian culture. And then I realised that there's actually very little on plebeian music specifically. And so I wanted to have a look at how music has a multifaceted impact on identity, because I think it's one of the most complex cultural forms. It can have an impact physically, even through vibrations, and socially, orally, and even the idea of music itself can be quite powerful. So yeah, I think that's, and then I began to realize focusing on plebeian identity in general is too big a topic, even for this niche subsection of plebeian culture. So I wanted to then focus on gender specifically, and engaging in Dwarf Woman's argument that conceptions of masculinity and femininity became more defined across the century. And I'm looking at how this is evident, or how it's not evident in plebeian music.
It speaks to the kind of historiographical dominance of woman, which is so helpful, often as a pushing off point, in fact, not always corroborating with this idea of this kind of fixed distinction between ancien and regime and modern gender. But it's so interesting to think about the ways in which you can bring personal interest into historical research, and actually, even from, I mean this is like, even from early stages of a historical career, actually, of how much of the personal kind of informs the writing of the history. And it's so interesting to think of it in that way. I think for me, I also began kind of my research in a way that was of personal interest. So I've always had a particular interest in the material, and always had a particular interest in kind of objects as ways to understand the past. As a child going around the V&A and things like that. But I think actually where my research is now, my clergyman project, is actually thinking about reflecting on kind of the failures of my own, or the limitations of my own past research. So I did a perfectly fine PhD, but it was absolutely secular. And having to teach early modern history has made me realise actually, kind of that the 18th century sits as this kind of bizarre kind of no man's land between, kind of the religious radicalism of the 17th century and the kind of evangelical Christianity of the 19th. And so it really struck me that actually I needed to write, in some sense, some form of kind of religious 18th century. But really, fundamentally, my study of men was too secular, is my critical reflection. And that really spurred me on to think, to then go on and produce work that really tries to interrogate that question. And as well, if thinking about the person, I was raised Catholic, and I'm no longer Catholic at all, but I find thinking about religion and the complexities of religious identity, especially one that you no longer, adhere to, is actually quite an interesting way to think about the past, and actually about people who have complicated relationships with religious identity. And identity probably is where we really coalesce in research ideas. I just maybe want to kind of invite you to speak a little bit more about what identity is, plebeian identity, gender identity, urban identity, even in the dissertation research project.
I think this is where maybe, obviously we both have an interest in identity, but this is maybe where my project differs from yours, because I don't have access to individual plebeian identity as much. There's a few cases where I do. For example, if a particular performance was recorded by someone on the street in writing, but it's still, I'm more focusing on group identity. And it's quite, which can be challenging, but at the same time, I think for being able to focus on group identity means I'm always trying to relate the individual to the group. The relationship between individual and group identity as well. And I think in terms of, well, as I said, I was originally going to focus on urban identity in general. And I just realized how central gender is to plebeian identity and how it's an entire topic in itself. And I'm also looking at how sexuality is related to gender identity as well, trying to understand different, I guess, how plebeians use music as a form of self-expression, and how gender identity was not only constructed through song but expressed through song as well. And so I think that although I'm focusing mostly on heteronormative gender identity, so it would be interesting if future projects looks at queer identities as well.
But you get to, and this is where our projects, you rightly point to some of those key differences. You know, excavating the queer life of plebeian people is an incredibly difficult thing to do. And, you know, we spoke at length, haven't we, about how music in your work can get past the privilege of the historical record. Actually, music as a critical entry point for the historian. You know, your work shows absolutely its utility in that sense. And I think it's interesting too about how we think differently about groups and individuals. Because I really am going from the group, the clergyman the clergy as a social group, and moving down into the individual tensions and problems and experiences. And that's a privilege of the historical record because clergymen were so prolific. But whereas with you have such a different, you have to have such a different methodology. And I wonder, you know, kind of, maybe we could speak a little bit more about methodology and sources, about kind of what actually, how do you access plebeian identity? What evidence do you have?
One of the sort of, I guess, unique parts about my project is that it's focusing on music itself. It's not just focusing on the textual side of ballads, for example, which has been what most historiography has looked at over the years. There's a few studies that have emerged recently which are looking at music more, but I think it's still something that's being developed. So I wanted to kind of jump in on that and look at the sort of the musical, textual and visual sources together. And I think this combination helps me represent the multifaceted impacts of music on identity. So I'm looking at ballads and song sheets, but also written accounts of performances and visual interpretations of performances, and even maps to try and think about how music operates in different spaces. So I guess I'm trying to reconstruct every aspect of a performance, the when, where, who, why, how, through a mixture of sources. So what sort of sources have you been using, Ben?
Again, it speaks to both a shared interest, but the historical record, because you have created this incredible bank of interdisciplinary sources, which is this kind of great approach of this kind of rich historical, thick description of a period through music and song. But that has taken us, you have got to go to this kind of piecemeal approach, whereas I am overwhelmed with the source material of which I have before me. Not only were, you know, the clergy prolific writers, but often they exist in their own right in collections and archives, but they also exist in kind of, you know, what larger deposits of towns, because they are part of town life. So there's just you find them everywhere. And I'm mainly looking at ego testimony. So I'm basically looking at life writings predominantly letters and diaries, but then kind of for some part of the project, I want to think about, clergymen. Did they have different access to economic participation? So, would a butcher lend kind of credit to the clergyman, but not to another member of the town? Was it them being clergymen that enabled them to participate differently in economic transactions? And for that, I would hope to use things like count books and court records. But the main source base, thinking actually about how clergymen wrote about themselves, and I think the difficulty I have with that is that often I'm not very interested actually really in kind of religious belief. I'm interested in religion as a form of social practice, but less so about kind of the religious beliefs of some of them. And of course that informs their identities, but I don't think it's a point of particular interest. So a large part of it is wading through some kind of long diatribes and interpretations of the Bible that are kind of unnecessary to my purposes. But that again varies hugely amongst the clergy. And so those are some of the problems I've encountered. And I mean, I'm starting this project. Might you reflect on what problems, difficulties, challenges the research has thrown up?
I think it is the main problem has been finding source material. It can be very tricky because a limited selection of ballads have survived, and those which have survived are predominantly those collected by elites in volumes. So it's hard to reconstruct plebeian voices when you have such a limited pool of sources, because perhaps some of the bawdier ballads haven't survived because the elites didn't approve of them. So but that's not to say that there aren't ballads which are on the sort of more bawdy side, because some people did collect those, and I've been able to look at how sexuality was portrayed through those ballads as well. There's also the problem of how many ballads don't have tunes written on them, so you don't know to what tune they were sung, and sometimes it's also hard to, even if you do have a tune, it's hard to then set the music against the text to know exactly how the music and text would have worked together. But I think to overcome these problems, I found that an intensive analytic approach is best. Even with just looking at one ballad, I can kind of use a historical imagination to try and reconstruct the plebeian voice through that one source and place it in context with other kinds of source, which is why a multi-source approach has been so important for my projects.
Yes, and of course you're doing some really wonderful things about thinking about notation and tune, and thinking, not just about these as so many historians are guilty of talking about ballads as textual documents, and isn't really actually not the basis of your analysis of them, is it? It's notation.
Absolutely, and I think ballads are not meant to be read on a piece of paper. They were intended to be performed orally, and people would, and ballad sellers particularly, would be able to recall many tunes from memory, and then use those as a sort of marketing tool. And I think that's what's interested me the most, is how sound plays such a pivotal role in the creation of gender identity, because it binds groups together and it can break through social and physical boundaries, often to the annoyance of the upper and middle ranks.
I will certainly be interested to see how many of my urban clergymen, hate ballad singers. I'll be interested to look out for it now. And that's one of the joys of doing these sorts of conversations, because you actually enriches your own work. I think we haven't spoken much about urban, because I mean, my project is quite interested in thinking about the geographical differences. So thinking about the kind of rural parish, thinking about the differences between an urban parish and rural parish, and thinking about the sorts of men that are wanting to be, the clergymen of St George's Hanover Square in the fashionable West End, and those that want a quiet kind of retiring life in Hampshire. I wonder what you think about what this work speaks to about, is it possible to find a rural plebeian music culture?
Well, it's interesting because a lot of ballad sellers were from rural areas, and it's because when they moved to the city in search of work, they didn't find the stability that they wanted, and then resorted to singing ballads on the streets, particularly women with who were unmarried or had children out of wedlock. It was a very accessible form of work. So I think in my project, actually, there's quite a bit of blending between the rural and the urban. But I do think it would be interesting to have studies on ballads in rural areas specifically, because ballads travel widely. I mean, you know, they were printed, and you can see the same ballads being printed sometimes in London and York, for example. So yeah, I'm sure that is a field of study which would be very interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting to think of the way in which this moves, and actually it makes the boundaries of the city for plebeian people quite porous. I think that's so interesting, because it makes me reflect about so much of what we're talking about here is spaces. You know, we're both interested in spaces, but for you, those spaces are kind of quite porous. And I think now, having had this conversation, it makes me think about maybe some of my clergymen, especially who travel, you know, who often go to the university towns where they trained and went to university, and then often go to London, and then go to rural parishes, and often have several parishes. Actually, how these identities are identities often in transit, and for you, mainly in transit between town and country, and within the city itself. You know, I know that you've done some interesting work thinking about, you know, if a ballad was sung in the East End or if it was sung in the West End, would it have different kind of social functions? I think that's a really interesting reflection. Maybe we're nearly up on our kind of allotted time. I wonder if we could mainly finish about kind of where we want to take these projects, what kind of impact these projects could have, what they could do to further historical knowledge.
So for me, my hope is that future studies will continue to look at musical, visual and textual sources together to try and reconstruct plebeian identities, and particularly in other aspects of plebeian identity. For example, foreignness was a category that I was originally wanting to consider, and I think that there's a lot of ballads which talk about being foreign or of a different race, and music is something that can it binds insiders together, but it also leaves outsiders on the edge. So it would be an interesting medium to look at that form of identity through, and I think more could also be done to look at as I said, queer identity, and there's also disability as well. It was a category that I was originally wanting to consider, as that's quite a complex field. And finally, instrumental music as well. I didn't have space to look at this, but there's definitely a lot of descriptions of instrumental music being performed. So actually, for my master's, I'm hoping to look at how foreign identity was constructed through music by looking specifically at Jewish musicians in 18th century London, because they were most of the time from impoverished backgrounds and sort of rose their way from rags to riches. And I think that will be an interesting way of looking at identity.
Because in that sense, what hopefully the future project will do is not just think about plebeian identity, but actually think about, again, a kind of social mobility that music perhaps is a part of. Yeah, and the ability of music to include and exclude is a common thread across all those ideas that you've been pursuing, you know, from gender through to those as well. Yeah, it's an interesting point. I think for me, it would be quite nice if it became a book, but only if time allowed. I think more work really needs to be done on religion and masculinity in the 18th century, because it is a huge part of continuity across early modern to the modern period, and yet receives such little attention by historians, because I wonder, on reflection, if I'm being critical of my colleagues, it's kind of less showy and dancey than, you know, commercialism and kind of, you know, so much more social and cultural histories of fops and rakes and dandies. You know, is there a religious fop? Is an interesting question. But hopefully it will not just encourage that, but it will encourage us to think a little bit more intersectionally about identity in the period, much in the same way that you are doing, is actually trying to think about how perhaps gender, ability, religion or ethnicity can work as a way, how that pulls and pushes on people. And, you know, not necessarily that these are in conflict with one another, but they are relational to one another in the sense of the way in which people experience their lives. And hopefully, actually, both our projects will do is contribute more to an ongoing kind of current political discussion about the role of intersectionality in critical discourse. And hopefully, our projects will be a small part of that in historical perspective. But yeah, thank you for your time today, Molly. It's been lovely to have a break from preparing to teach on Ming China and to talk about our research together. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having this conversation with me. It's always nice to compare projects, and it makes you think more about what you're doing in your own, and it's made me rethink some stuff, so thank you.
I'll be absolutely on the hunt for clergymen moaning about ballad singers. So great. Thanks, Molly.
Thank you.